Welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Join us as we dive deep into games you know or may never have heard of. I am your host, Max, and joining me is my co-host, Troy. Working behind the scenes, as usual, is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about the mass battle game Hobgoblin. This has been an eye-opener for me. Like, Troy, you've been telling me about this for a while now. And I'm just like, oh, okay. I don't play a lot of mass battle ancient style games. I probably should.
This was one that was on my radar after it kickstarted. I was a late backer to it. And then when we got the demo rules throughout the process of production, it really grabbed me. I had a lot of fun jamming with it at the start of this year. And now that we've got the hard copy, the physical book, and the components, wow, this game rocks.
Yeah, I've definitely, I'm slowly falling in love with this game because it kind of fixes all the things that those other games of the same style bug me with, which is mainly that they get kind of bogged down. But we'll get into that when we get to the rules. So, Troy, let's set up, where does this game come from? Who makes it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to give the breakdown of this game because Hobgoblin, let's take it from the top. It's a brutal fantasy war game. It's fast, it's exciting, it's dynamic. It's designed by Mike Hutchinson, who has also designed a few other titles. He has Gaslands under his belt, which is a really inventive game where you take non-wargaming models, typically cars, things like that, and you strap bits onto them to weaponize them and wargame them up. And then you do car battles.
And that was a cool idea that it's an interesting take on a model agnostic game.
100%.
So I knew I was aware of Gaslands. I think that of Hutchinson's stuff, that was the one that I was already aware of, but I hadn't played it. And it was like, oh, okay, that kind of seems cool.
A Billion Suns is his sci-fi spaceship game. And that is it couldn't be more different than Armada was or some of these other spaceship games. It's got a very different paradigm that it embraces, and you're actually playing on different playing surfaces with A Billion Suns. You'll have Sector A and Sector B, and they are different surfaces that your ships do not go between. It's wild. So there's some really inventive stuff. Where Hobgoblin comes from itself is it is sort of taking rank and flank, a classic wargaming concept. It's old school, but it's taking those large scale battles and that rectangle maneuvering, and it's bringing it way forward in terms of its design and its approachability as an actual game. The design really does emphasize a fast-paced and dangerous high-stakes game. So you get a lot of destroyed units. You get a lot of bloody battles, right? But it doesn't take all day to do this because of the way that it resolves morale and damage, like we'll get into. But you can have a really satisfying game in an hour and a half with bigger forces than you would have in an equivalent game of Old World or Oathmark or Kings of War, for example. It allows you to really engage with your collection in a new way where you're not looking at them as units that you have bought that have rules that have come with the models. The way this game approaches things is you are coming up with keywords from a list. Well, they're from a list, so you're not coming up with them, but you're selecting them and assigning them to your units. So in a way, you get to decide what the value of these different models is. It's not prescribed by the design house. You are the one who is coming up with the characteristics to match the models that you are inspired to paint. And that's part of the design ethos of this game. And it throws to be dramatic, it throws the shackles off of a game that is telling you, okay, these are the Dragon Riders and they work like this. So they actually kind of have lame rules, but they're great looking models. So you want to include them anyways, but they're kind of weak. You don't have to worry about that with this. There's a totally other way to approach your collection. And another point about the designer, Mike Hutchinson, is that he also is pretty active in the community in terms of running a podcast and being on YouTube. So there's lots of like game design notes and discussion from him that you can engage with through the Rule of Carnage podcast and YouTube show. And they openly talk about like the design process for Hobgoblin on that show. So it's really cool if you want to get behind the scenes and get a different perspective on things. And I think that makes this designer uniquely interesting in that they kind of like show you how the sausage gets made.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, to the book itself, it's a beautiful book. One thing I think that stands out to me about it immediately as compared to other wargame rule books is how airy it feels and how approachable a lot of it. Like there's this really great use of white space. There's good use of background art and texture. Really, really interesting looking shots of miniatures on the field with some two-tone lighting. It's usually like purple cyan. I suppose that's the color palette. And then like a nice variety of art styles they kind of range from impressionistically evocative ruins to, I wouldn't say cartoony, but like very stylized looking comic art, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it really works. Like it's sparing enough that it doesn't overplay itself, and yeah, it's so much more approachable and easy to read. It's 150 pages ish, but it doesn't feel like 150 pages, which was actually really amazing to me, especially from reading a lot of older books where they're really dense and they look dense.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's using like a reasonable type size, very readable font. A lot of the headers have got really cool look to them. And yeah, it's double column. It's got little breakouts and side annotations that are kind of like box text. And it's very consistent. Like the whole look of it, both the drawn art and the photography just mesh super well together. I usually have pretty big reservations in terms of what war games look like. Like sometimes they either really excel in one area, but then that makes it more unbalanced in another. And in this case, I really like the way that it looks, and it doesn't feel intimidating to flip through it, and it's got all kinds of really cool little bits. It's well designated. I mean, Troy, you have an actual physical copy of this, so you probably have an even better impression. Yeah.
I've got the hard copy that I really enjoy. I want to call out two of the artists. CROM, who does like some of the really metal looking art of dudes smashing dudes. Like that is awesome.
Yeah.
And then Sean Sutter from Relic Blade, Metal King Studios. They did a lot of the sketch work in here as well. And if you are a fan of indie wargaming, then Relic Blade and Sludge by Sean Sutter are also worth checking out for sure.
Yeah. And that's got more of a sort of heavier, but more structured, blocky kind of two-tone shading style, which is really cool. And yeah, both of them work really well as being both expressionistically like action filled and also having this sort of solidity.
And the miniatures they photograph in the book are all 3D print models for the most part, I believe. So they're like STLs that have been printed from a few different people, like Highland Miniatures, OPRs in there. So there's a few different people, but it goes to show that you can source miniatures for this if you want to that are extremely custom. Like you can go all the way and be the only person in the world with this army if you are so motivated. And that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And the last point I want to make about the book is that Greg Horton was the graphic design and layout guy, and he's done a great job as well. So everyone who was involved on this, I think, was able to make a really clean, crisp production of a war game that doesn't fall into the trope of being like a Google Doc made into a PDF like you find on Wargame Vault. You know what I mean?
The actual production of printing was well considered for this.
Now, to move on to the game of Hobgoblin itself, we've kind of alluded to one of the key elements of it, but when you start to play this game, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to build your army. And there aren't army lists. There's no pre-existing factions that you will be picking or joining. so to speak. You will pick your army based on the models that you want to use. It is a miniature agnostic game, meaning there are not models made specifically for this game, and that it is also a game that encourages you to use models from a range of really any manufacturer. So what you'll do is you'll look at your units that you want to include in your army. They could be Age of Sigmar models, they could be STLs you've printed, they could be whatever you have. And you look at them and define them by type. So they could be light infantry, heavy cavalry, they could be chariots, whatever the model actually looks like. And then it gets interesting because you start to assign keywords, either strengths or weaknesses, that change and modify the behavior of the unit. And this is where the flavor comes in. The difference between light infantry and heavy infantry is both in how it strikes its targets, which we'll talk about briefly here, but heavy infantry have the keyword tough. So anytime they take doom or suffer damage, they -1 to the total of damage they take. And that's a really simple way of putting plate mail onto a unit, so to speak, right? Now you've got your heavy infantry with their tower shields and their plate, and they're blocking damage. And it's not a ton of stuff to track, to know, to be aware of, but these keywords start to offer these distinctions that play out in the game in meaningful ways.
Yeah. One way that I kind of liken it is each unit in the game is almost treated like the way that you would break out an army and say, like, for example, like a platoon in a World War II game, where it has this base template, which is the structure of the unit itself, and then you add these support things that kind of add characteristic to it. So in this case, those would be the keywords. So it's almost like each unit is got these little customizable elements that you can pop in and out based on what you think it should work like.
Absolutely.
And like other games make use of this, but you're right, they're more hard baked into the way that those rules or those units are intended to be run. Whereas in this case, it's just a list of stuff, and the more things you stick onto it, the more the point cost and that aspect, but you can really go crazy with it.
You can make like a 1,300 point character who is both a general, a hero, a battle standard bearer, and a wizard who's a monster. Like you could make like a greater demon of something, right? And they could just wreck face. But you've put all your eggs in one basket. And the way this game is balanced, you can make whatever you want, but it will, as just as Max said, it's going to drive that point cost up, and it's going to put you in a position where you will lose maneuvering flexibility, because this is a block war game.
Yeah.
So the movement phase is the game. If you don't capitalize on the opportunities presented to you in the movement phase, it doesn't matter how hot your dice are, you will not win. And not that you play to win per se, but you know what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
With these egg in one basket characters, like a greater demon of Tzeentch that you create in this game, who's magic and flying and a demon and all these things, it can only be in one place at a time.
Yeah.
And there are a number of different objective types, because there's a deck of cards you can get, or you can play it out of the really excellent app that's available, that's free for this game. And these cards will determine your deployment, your twist, your objectives. And many times you're going to be in a position where these different random elements are going to be pulling and contrasting each other, where you're going to need different unit classes. You're going to need light cavalry to make moves and get places. You might need flyers. You might need a variety of things because of the chance this deck will give you, or the chance the app will when you generate your chaos of war. But it really, to me, gives you the choice in how you want to approach these problems in a really grand way, because you're not just picking, I'm the undead, I'm the dwarves. You could be undead dwarves, and you could be doing a variety of different things with these unit choices to whatever goal you're seeing your strategic aim to be. And you're not like locked into a faction identity with that sort of like presented to you.
Yeah. I mean, but if you're running a campaign of this, you could certainly use a certain theming between, say, two different players
Yep.
to then exclusively use certain keywords in order to establish that. So it's not beyond to do that.
That's a really good point, actually.
But the nice thing is that it's balanced and built in such a way that you can mix and match. And it's always fun to have that little exception, to have that odd unit that works just a little differently. Maybe borrows a bit from his enemy or has some X factor that isn't being used at this point, and make those characters feel fresh. Especially in something that has the scale that this has. And that's another criticism that I generally have for a lot of like large scale war games, is that it often can feel like after a while just sliding blocks into other blocks and then deleting them. And the tactics they can become a little bit mechanically obvious after a while, and then it can become tedious. This game, though, so smooth in the way that it handles a lot of that. And with that variety of building units, you're always going to end up with a little twist where this works a little differently, and you don't really know what's going to happen when these two guys run into each other.
Well, let's talk about that now, because we've talked about defining units. They're a type and then keywords, but the types cross, and that's where this gets interesting, because you're not like, I'm heavy infantry, I hit on 3 or higher. You're heavy infantry, you hit on a target number relative to your target. So heavy infantry fighting heavy infantry, you're hitting on 5s. If you're hitting light infantry, you're hitting on 4s. Ranged infantry, you have a different hitting value. Again, different target number. So it's rock, paper, scissors across unit type. So you need to consider not just what keywords you've put on somebody, but who they will have favorable matchups against.
Mm-hmm.
And it also leads to composition choices in your army list building again, where you don't just only want to take heavy infantry and like a whole line of heavy infantry all with their tower shields again, because they can get hard countered by monsters who, in the designer notes of this game at the back of the book, he kind of talks about the circle of counters and how like stuff that's tightly packed together, like a heavy infantry unit, would be more vulnerable to something like a big monster, where light infantry is actually less vulnerable because of their dispersed formation. However, the game doesn't actually have these different formations. The units are just rectangular templates with models on top of them that don't change shape in any way. Like they don't reform in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
it's assumed that there is a formation within that template, and that is a factor that's considered in the way these target numbers are assigned. So it's really clever without there being units that are just like, oh, this is my elite swordsman unit, I want it to do everything for me. It's like you can make an elite swordsman unit, you can give it the elite keyword, you can give it the brutal keyword. Now it's rerolling misses, and it gets a -1 to the target number of whatever it's trying to hit. So it's like a +1 to hit kind of. And you could easily have that as your elite swordsman unit, but there still always is the counter to that. It won't just be a golden Death Star that can roam the battlefield smoking anything. You know what I mean? Like if you find the right unit that can come in on the flank on that thing, it's lights out.
Yeah, and it makes it feel a lot less like a number fight. I mean, it is, obviously, because there are these different variables, but because each unit type crosses with a different one in a different way, you're really encouraged to have something of a mix of units. And then when they're on the table and you've applied all those keywords, you want to position them differently. And now that it underlines not only compatibility between combatant units, but it also underlines how those units will move, how they'll be tactically placed when you deploy them. Games will still have, like other games will still have these things, but in this case, it kind of underscores that point about, oh, this does this and it's good against that. I'm starting to think about how that'll actually like play out.
You're absolutely right. And like the economy by which this game achieves that outcome really appeals to me. There's not a lot of stuff in the way to get to these distinctions. There is a chart. Some people don't like charts. The app eliminates the chart practically. So if you want to play out of the app, you just click target numbers and it will just tell you for this unit, this is the target number, including keyword modifiers. So it's very simple. But if you're playing out of the rule book, you'll be looking at the chart in the back of the book. You know, I'm a light infantry. I am striking a chariot. Therefore, I am hitting it on this. And Charts are charts. There's a long history of charts in war games, and they have their place. And I think in this example, it is actually the better way of achieving this unit-to-unit relation in what's good at striking what. Another thing that I want to bring up in this game as well, this is something that is handled differently in many different games across the rank and flank block war game, right? But it's the concept of how does contact get handled between these units.
Yeah.
And in Hobgoblin, it has a really refreshing approach. I've played a little bit more rank and flank than Max has. But Max, what was your immediate impression of how movement and contact felt between the regiments in this game?
So this was one of the things that felt a lot more fluid, for lack of a better word, in the sense that there weren't these blocky kind of like matchups where they kind of click together, but it's more of just these, you can connect with any unit effectively in almost any way. They have different things that happen when you do that, but it was nice to just be able to have the freedom to move pieces around. There's a certain amount of movement variables, like shifting to the side is more taxing to unit than marching forward, and backward similarly so. But yeah, and it's got all your classic wheeling maneuvers and advances and all those other things. But I didn't have to think about how those units would, like in quotations, connect with each other. I mean, I did, but it was just, hey, I need these two guys to close in and box in this unit. And I just did that and it worked out fine.
Like one of the things you see in so many rank and flank games in fantasy or historical, it's what Max mentioned there, is the click.
Yeah.
Where these units get within a certain proximity or they make a certain contact, and there is a reformation to put them in a certain alignment, we'll call it. And in Hobgoblin, that ain't the case. Stuff does not magically slide about. So, I mean, not to say that that doesn't have a place in certain games, and it can be balanced around that working well, but the way in which these units just hit each other and the way you caught them means you don't have like, okay, my guy hits your frontage, so therefore your frontage is consumed by my unit. So the only way I can now make secondary contact is through a flank attack. Like in Hobgoblin, if I get you half your frontage with one unit, I can get the other half of your frontage with a different unit. And you could conversely do that back to me. So it creates these like more complicated geometric equations, maybe is a way to describe it, where you're like trying to figure out, like, if I wheel thusly and reform in such a way, what can I achieve with that to make the most favorable contacts? And it won't click, 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 slide like some clockwork happening. It'll form to the more organic state of the battle as it progresses. And if you're in contact on the flank, you're reduced in the number of dice you can throw. And if you're touching multiple units, you have to commit a minimum of 3 dice to each unit you're in contact with. So there are limitations to make this not like a free-for-all. But this part of the game, this is where I really feel like the juice comes in when you're playing on the tabletop. Like when you before the game, you have these keywords and these unit types, and the army list building is great. But when you're on the tabletop, it's this maneuver and the way the units hit each other that just creates really satisfying moments. And we were doing a demo game yesterday, and the way the battle line started to form and the second line did their maneuver to like sidestep shuffle to join the fight was really cool. It was really interesting, and it felt like we had to think our way through the maneuvers, not in a way where it's like obnoxiously like I can do a half-inch wheel, but like sliding this way, up this way, making the maneuver. It really had a sense of like tactical fulfillment in the battle itself.
One thing that I would note about the fact that the units don't like click into each other in a perfectly evenly geometrical sense is that there's actually a tactical consideration now for wanting to do that intentionally. So for instance, like when we were playing, I had one unit engage at a like they were head on to each other, but I wasn't directly in contact with the other unit, leaving some space. And I actually moved a second unit into that gap so that both were attacking the single one together. One tactical consideration about getting the evenness is that Troy could shuffle his unit over to then close that space so that I couldn't bring a second unit to support the first.
Yeah.
Right. So rather than it being a defaultive thing where these two things just like Lego blocks like click into each other, leaving that off-center gap is actually like a vulnerability that now you might have to intentionally level them out.
You know what? That's absolutely true.
And like, that's so much more interesting because it's like, oh yeah, I have this space, but now I'm basically inviting a 2v1.
Yeah, exactly. And there might be units that are keyworded up that could handle that. But a lot of the time, if you're going to open yourself up to getting outmaneuvered in that way, you're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
That to me is really satisfying because you're not just like, my unit is a superior unit to your unit. I get the frontal contact. We click in. I deny any other contact to this unit now as I have created the soul engagement. Like, you know what I mean? Like it has a flow that I really enjoyed. And then once your units have made contact, it's pretty straightforward how you're going to resolve the fighting. You roll 10 to 13 dice, depending on the unit's keywords, depending on who's hitting who.
Yeah. D6s for anyone that's interested. It's a D6 base game.
That's right. Thank you.
So pretty familiar to most people that are, you know, I'd say that's a traditional die to pick.
It is. It absolutely is. And then you'll use this straightforward dice system. Like you roll for hits. If it is, like we said, the units are crossing each other. So like I will rock, paper, scissors you needing a target number of 3. And you will rock, paper, scissors me, but you're going to need a 6 because you're not going to win this one. And then you roll off whatever hits. There's no armor save. If you have the keyword tough, you'll block whatever your toughness value is of incoming doom, as it is referred to. But these hits will then become doom and go against your courage value. Doom adds up and is accumulated as the damage in this game. And once it meets or exceeds the courage value of a unit, it becomes broken and is removed from play. When a unit breaks, it causes panic. And that means other units within 8 inches will acquire another point of doom. And this can cascade. And that's another really important point to make. I almost forgot this, is that doom is not calculated right when you take it. It's almost Battletech-y in that way, where doom happens at the end of the phase, the end of the turn. Then doom is applied and units are destroyed. So if you get a cavalry charge in, and then your cavalry happens to get obliterated just by the way the dice go, they still get their round. They still get their charge to make their dramatic impact. They're not totally denied that opportunity just because the dice gods decided they would be slain today, you know?
Actually, that's a good segue into one of my favorite aspects, or not that it's the only game that does this, but the way that the activation in phases works.
Good point.
It's not a you go, I go, you know, you're engaging and activating all of your units at once, and then it flips over to me. But it's actually broken out into a series of phases that involve each player resolving that phase before moving on to the next. So, Troy, let's break down those phases.
Oh, yes. The phase structure is actually really cool. It's simple, but that is to its advantage in a war game, right? I believe that's something that you want to see in war games is approachable phase structures so that you don't get completely lost in what you're trying to do. And how this game would work is first is the initiative phase, where you have the first player roll a d6. If the result equal or beats the current battle round number, the current turn, the first player, they may take the first player token or leave it with the opponent. So that means that you can lose the first player as the game goes on, as you roll for initiative at the start of the turn. Then you enter a magic phase where you gain the Mercury tokens. You just get these to power your spells. You cast your spells, and that would be using the abyssal sorcery rules in this game. There's different spell lores and a lot of different magic. So that's a whole really detailed, really characterful part of this game. And that ties more into the lore of the setting a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But after you do magic, interestingly, before movement, you're into the shooting phase. And I I like that. I think that's cool timing. And you'll do the first player does all of their shooting with unengaged ranged units. Then the second player performs their shooting with unengaged ranged units. So it's not turn 1A, turn 1B. It's turn 1 shooting AB. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so you've got your two players, and then you proceed through these phases with the first player acting out that phase, and then the second player acting out the phase, and then you go to the next phase and repeat until you hit the bottom. And that sounds cumbersome, but man, does it flow fast.
It does.
It's nice. It almost feels like each section of the game has its own little theme, which is, it's like, now all the archers fire, and then the units advance. And then if any units come in contact, then the combat is resolved. So yeah, that'll move us into the next phase, which is movement. Yeah, and so movement is determined by the unit type for the most part. You can imagine, like, obviously cavalry and chariot units get pretty big advances.
Yeah, they're much faster.
Yeah, and other units move at varying other speeds.
You can do a 360 reform for 5 movement points or 5 inches of your movement allowance. So you're not stuck trying to wheel, counter wheel, spin. Like, you don't have to do a really cumbersome maneuvering. You can just spend the 5 inches and spin them on the spot.
And there's some varied cost, as I mentioned earlier, to effectively shifting or strafing a unit or retreating them. But it's essentially like a double cost in that case. And wheeling's nice because it's pretty much the same as advancing. It's just 1 inch per from the corner to the pivot point on the same side.
So it is, in terms of rank and flank movement, I really love it. I could easily get units moving to where I wanted. It didn't produce like weird ships passing in the night feelings where things are really awkward to move and they don't connect right, or they miss each other in a sort of artificial way. Like, things go where you anticipate them to go. You can control the movement in a meaningful way, but you're still constrained by these templates that have to maneuver over terrain and around them, and they can't pass through each other. That's something about this game, is these shapes don't change and they don't go through each other. They're blocks in a physical sense. So you have to be very mindful of how you do move everything. If you're moving in a column or in a line, you have to know your units can't clip each other. You're going to have a certain thought process to how you maneuver a little bit, which sounds harder than it is. Like, when you're doing it, it's not too bad, but it is worth bearing in mind because there's no like pass through mechanic like you might see in some historical games where like a Roman cohort can, like, you know what I mean, change formation and then you can run through them. That doesn't quite work the same here, but the mechanics themselves are simple enough that you're never in a position where you're like confused by how you will maneuver your units in a fundamental way just based on the mechanics. It's more like, how do I get around the roadblock I've created for myself with my charge here?
Yeah, I mean, like, even in our game, there was a point where one of your units clipped a piece of terrain, and we had to check and see that essentially that counted as rough ground. So now you had to go through that if you wanted to engage my unit.
Yeah, I would have either got the distracted keyword, which is a keyword you acquire and discard at the end of the turn. And that means you can't effectively charge into a new combat. And that's what happens when you shoot. You gain distracted as well. So it means if you shoot, you can't charge for the most part. And same thing here. If I was to run through this rough terrain, I would gain distracted, unable to charge. Or I can take a pointed doom and make that charge connect. So I took the doom. Those guys later died. So you tell me if that was a good call. But that's how it went. And it's these relatively simple interactions that create meaningful decision points, which I really enjoy. And once you've gotten into the doom phase and you've gone through that and the turn resets, you're rechecking your initiative, you're going back into shooting, and you're playing a relatively fast-playing game where you're getting these meaningful payoffs without having to wait for another player to finish their whole turn. You're not having to wait 2 hours to finally get to turn 4 where the real fight starts. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I was really impressed with how smoothly it ran and how intuitive it was. So yeah, it's like going from an initiative, we didn't have any casters, so that was off. But yeah, going to shooting, then movement, then combat, and then basically making an account with the Doom phase of everything that happened. And the fun thing is with the consequences of combat coming at the end is that units that are quote unquote dead actually kind of like go out in a blaze of glory.
Yeah, I love that.
So there is a very decent chance that you could mutually destroy each other, depending on how evenly the fight went.
Absolutely.
It had this dramatic feel of just, these hordes smashing into each other and then basically just completely falling apart and then moving another unit from behind to then connect while that other one was destroyed. And yeah, it's just this nice, smooth sequence of things happening. And it went through pretty quick.
Yeah.
It was total rounds for our game were 3.
No, we played a 5 round.
Oh, sorry, it was 5.
And then we were like 75 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, but by the 3rd round we had hit like effectively a tipping point.
Yeah.
And you still had stuff lined up in the back. I know you had that chariot that was ready to go, and
yep.
It kind of got ganged up on because everything folded so quickly. But it was still fun, like just to see, like I was still kind of sweating it. I'm like, I don't know, what's that thing gonna do?
Yeah, 100%. Like keeping a reserve in this game is meaningful and it actually pays off. And this is something I wanted to ask you about. Okay, Doom. This means damage. And this means 2 types of damage because it's being compared to a courage stat. So we know it means morale.
This doesn't have this game doesn't have a specific morale system. It's very streamlined in this regard. But go ahead. What was your?
So the other point is Doom is also representative of casualties because that's the degradation of units and their eventual destruction.
Right.
How do you feel about a system that manages to do both with one thing, or perhaps less favorably omits something to focus on just one of them? Do you think that works in this example, or what are your takeaways on that?
I mean, it's not too dissimilar from the argument around hit points in like Dungeons and Dragons, which is like, what does that actually represent? And some other systems, I can think of the D20 Star Wars having split that into effectively the sort of stamina and flesh aspects. And I know a bunch of other games do that too. And that's kind of an ongoing debate. And that even exists in wargaming. For instance, a lot of the shock or stress mechanics in Too Fat Lardy's games have an idea of the amount of strain that a unit is under versus the number of units or components to a unit that it's affected by.
Yeah.
So you can kind of think of it as these 2 values that are kind of crossing each other. I have a bit of a preference to that because it tells me more about what's going on. But the one thing, and this is why it exists in Dungeons and Dragons for the most part, because that was generally promoted through conventions early on, is that hit points is just expedient, right? Like you get hit and you take the number, and if the number goes over the maximum, if you're counting, say, damage up, or if you're counting hit points down, you either exceed your maximum threshold of damage or you run out of hit points and you're dead.
Yeah.
And by the way that everything else is affected in this game, or the way that the game is built for that kind of smooth, quick gameplay, it makes sense to do it that way. I don't think you have to do it that way. I'm of the mind that if you streamline one thing, you can actually add a little bit of nuance and complexity back in.
Yeah.
But as a keeping to a theme, I think this game does a really good job of just being like, you can pick this up, put together a bunch of units for whatever you want your army to be, and then just start going. And, you'll have a game over and done with in under an hour, depending on how big it is, obviously.
Yeah, right. And now, before we get on to the lore of this game, like its own bespoke setting, it's actually really great at doing other settings as a toolbox. So if you wanted to do like a high fantasy battle, and I will argue this is more of a high fantasy game, rather than like a closer to historical low fantasy, to use the term. If you wanted to play like a high fantasy game, like say you're doing an Age of Sigmar, or you're in the Realms of Faerun or something, you could absolutely use this game without the blink of an eye And that doom concept can start to mean different things. So in Age of Sigmar, even though this game is tracking it as courage, that's pretty much like blood and bones. Like it's no one's running away. Everyone's fighting to the last. It's heavy metal music blaring. We're going for it. Whereas if you're playing Faerun, that might really be much more of a psychological concept, as these, elves and humans and dwarves don't just want to get slain. They might run away. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of look at like some of the mechanics of this game in different lights, depending on the setting that you want to, or the lens of the setting you want to apply. And because I have a good collection of the Warhammer models, I actually really enjoy getting to use them in this game and kind of like recontextualize them now.
It's really, because it's component based, it's really easy to just adapt this to whatever situation. And because it's so light, it actually makes probably a decent companion game to whatever role playing you might like. If you want mass combat in your role playing and you're not using like a super abstracted or streamlined system that might be provided, I can think MCDM's got their kind of card based one that's very abstract, but seems like fun. But if you wanted something that was a little bit more meaty, and maybe had that more fine grained tactics, I would argue that this is probably a good one to go with, because it's that streamlining again. It makes it feel very easy to pick up and get going.
Yeah, 100%.
As to the lore of this setting that is baked into this, and it's weird because like it occupies this really interesting space where it has these, I want to say it's more evocative than specific, but it almost falls into a similar philosophy that Troika does. We haven't covered that game, but Troika uses it deliberately, has the idea of, we don't really know what that means, but it sounds cool, and you can decide at the table when you play this game what the hell that is. This is a bit more specific in that it has a lot more stuff going into it, but the setting was the thing that got me for this game. And how it's not the best hardcore role-playing setting is maybe that's just a matter of time. So the world in this game is an entirely subterranean world. Okay, not exactly, but it has this really cool theming of the sort of classic fire and ice, but it does that with this almost dungeon viewpoint. So the surface of this world is essentially in a permanent ice age. And it is basically, I don't even know if it's just the natural state of things. I think it's suggested as to be sort of an apocalyptic event, but it's brought all of the action in the world to underground caves. And so you have these different layers going down, and as you go down, it gets hotter and hotter. So you have your top layer, which is a sort of frozen catacombs, and I suppose suggests something like a surface world. And it has undead and ice elves and wraith knights. And again, these are just sort of like, it's giving you a vibe. I sort of think of it as frozen undead, which is a really cool idea.
Yeah.
And then as you get underneath that, there's these labyrinths of interconnecting tunnels that have dwarf kingdoms, and it's more of a temperate zone. So some of that heat has made its way into this area, but it's probably close to what the surface in our world would be like. And it's more of the, I suppose, the civilized part, or that's where a lot of the more established kingdoms and cities are. And then going below that, you've got a tropical region, which is just full of essentially monsters. So things grow large, they get nasty. There's all kinds of giant fungal forests and huge insects and reptile troglodyte creatures. And that sounds like more of like a savage jungle layer. And then below that, you're essentially in like an infernal realm of demons and fire dwarves rivers of magma and all this stuff. And I'm just like, that's so cool, because it's like the idea of take your traditional fantasy setting and then sandwich it between two versions of terrible. And between there's some livable space. But I want to say that I don't want to say that it's exactly like Dark Sun, which is more of like a dying Earth setting, but this has a very like trapped between a terrible situation and another terrible situation. And it gives a reason for this sort of perpetual conflict to be churned out. Another cool aspect of the world is that there's this sort of emergence of these artifacts that they're basically magic items that have the cost of being possessed and turned into haunted wraiths.
Yeah, 100%. It's kind of like getting like One Ring vibes, but like other things can do that to you, and they'll give you the ability to summon an army or have crazy magic powers, but they will also pretty much doom you to eternal damnation.
Yeah, and it's just a really good setting for the idea of kind of perpetual conflict and making that make sense in the way that you've taken all of the tension that would exist in a normal fantasy world and you've bottled it up in a small space.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, no, I've already started toying with this concept for a role-playing campaign, which I don't know when I'll be able to run it, but it's something I'm definitely interested in putting on, as just having that immediate tension and being like, I don't even think it's that original. It's just an interesting take on almost a post-apocalyptic world
and
an Underdark setting, and kind of mashing that into a way that makes it high tension. So obviously it works great for a wargaming, because it's like, oh, well, any excuse. People are fighting over resources and space, and some groups are just more directly malicious than others for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And it creates this amazing turnover. And it's nice because it's not so specific that you can't make it your own. In fact, they even say like the area that's listed out on this beautiful vertical map that basically shows the stratified layers, and it's even got like specific names of places and things like that. But it just describes it as if you were to slice an apple and the hot center would be the core. That's just one slice of apple, right? You could set yours on a completely different side of this spheroid and it would still structurally be the same. It'd still have the freezing cold surface and the molten center, but you can easily make it your own. And that, again, leans into the model agnostic. It's like, oh, well, it describes this fantasy setting with all these particular things, which, again, are still open-ended, but I have these weird models that don't fit into that. Well, just set it somewhere else and make up your own idea.
That is something you can absolutely do, too. It's like, if you wanted to run this for another setting in the Rotvärlden, base setting, or even come up with your own, it would really work well for any of the above, because you're assigning the keywords, you're picking the models.
Yeah, exactly. And the examples that are given are more like a thematic suggestion on how you might execute that. And yeah, there's a certain theming. Like there's a very, I want to say it's got a kind of Scandinavian naming convention.
Yeah, it does.
For the most part. It's not shy about it.
It's kind of where the black metal theming kind of comes in, with like the font choices and everything.
Yeah, Isvarden is like the frozen catacombs.
It's great.
That I like it, and obviously that comes with its own theming that suggests a certain style of play. But you could take a totally different area and then base it on like Arabic mythology or Greek mythology or whatever you're feeling, whatever your components support.
Yeah, 100%.
It's described as a wide world, and I think the thing that seems more the constant theming of it is the idea of this hot to cold as you go closer to the surface.
Yeah.
But otherwise, how you express that, like, even looking at some of the miniatures that they have in here, you've got crazy fire demons, which obviously are from lower down, but then there's like gnolls and undead and crazy artillery pieces, dwarves, elves, they really did a good job of showing you what you can do, but also suggesting you can do anything, which is, I think, the best approach to that kind of a game where you don't know what people have and you want them to feel like they can use whatever they've got. So you give it a vibe, you give it something evocative, whatever words or terms, have some lore that, again, is not super specific, but it's really starting to open your mind up to that story idea, and then just kind of leave it open. I honestly think at its best, Warhammer 40K does this, though it's debatable how well it does it now.
Yeah.
Because of how established it's gotten itself. But if you read like 3rd edition, it has these very specific parts, but it really suggests there's a lot going on in between those things.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you go back to Rogue Trader, Rogue Trader is like the extreme of that, where it's like, hey, whatever you want.
The classic line I always think of is beyond the gates of Antares,
Oh, yeah.
Because that's just like, what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything, but like, that's a classic game designer line that has that, like, they come from the other part of the universe that we haven't defined that maybe you will, and I always like when you're served up on a platter, the opportunity to bring your touch to a setting. And like, it's just part and parcel of this whole Hobgoblin experience is you get to bring so much of your own interest to this game. And that to me is one of my big takeaways here is like, I already have a collection and I already have campaigns, but I can use this with pretty much everything I already have.
And I didn't feel rudderless either with the way the lore was constructed. That like there's definitely a specific thing going in here, but it's a lot of it is left up to interpretation.
And I would totally do an RPG in this setting. Like I would play that, no doubt. So when the stars align, 100%.
Yeah, we'll see where I end up with that, but I'm definitely keen on that theming and that idea of dark fantasy with those elements. So yeah. Anything else? Any other? What are your final thoughts on all of this?
My final takeaway is if you're going to do a high fantasy block-based war game, this is the one you want to play. It is high fantasy in that psychology is simplified down into a damage statistic and not something that influences the specific behavior of the units. And that's something I look for in more historical or historically derived things like a low fantasy setting. So there may be other games that really strike me more personally for those themes. But in terms of something that is magic first, dramatic, bold, maybe violent, Hobgoblin is going to give you that so effectively, so cleanly. There's pretty much not an alternative in my eyes. There's a lot of great games and people will play what makes them happiest. But when I get a chance to play Hobgoblin, I've got these from War Bases in the UK. I've got my templates, my Sabo bases. I fit my different models. Sometimes they're Oathmark, sometimes they're Age of Sigmar, like whatever. Put them into these trays. And then like I'm ready to go. Mm-hmm. It's not a lot of messing about. There's not a lot of stuff. You can use this really convenient app to write your army lists. There's a lot of convenience that has been put forward into the way this game plays. And it just allows you to get to grips with it. And for someone who's wanted to be able to play like in childhood, I tried to play Warhammer Fantasy Battles, but it was like too much to take on. And this allows me to evoke some of that, but today now in a way more accessible format with what I already have available to me. And am I telling like Rotvärlden stories like they have included in the book? I'm not sure. I might be telling my own stories, but I have also found that setting and the lore provided is awesome and totally supports the type of endless battle that basically a war game kind of asks of a setting, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's basically a short novel hidden inside the back of this book, which I mean, I've kind of skimmed through it, but again, it really points to what is established in the setting is really, really good, and it feels like it supports the kind of game that it purports to be. So, like, I definitely want to read through this in more detail.
I just want to turn this around on you, Max, because I've been involved in this side of miniature gaming for a little bit of time. For you who's newer to this, what was your takeaway?
This made me want to play those kinds of games, mostly just because it seemed it had flavor, but it was also not overly complex. It had enough crunch to it, because I'm not somebody that's 100% rules light. I tend to like something of a balance. I like to know some of those edge cases, and it both answers what those edge cases are, both in terms of rules and lore, but it also leaves a lot of it up to you, with enough suggestion as to exactly how that would play out. And I didn't find it overbearing. I'm still reading it. Like, even having gone through it, I'm going back to sections and looking at that. Yeah, it's made me more interested in this type of game. And it's funny, for somebody that, like, I like fantasy role-playing games, and I've always wanted to have some kind of companion war game to do things like mass battles, but the overhead on a lot of them turned me off.
Yeah.
And this is not having that effect. I'm into this. I like it, and I want to play more of it.
That's awesome. I'm so glad. And when it comes to miniature agnostic games, I think this is a really exciting demonstration of that. And that's going to be our next episode. We're going to go in on the topic of miniature agnostic games. What are they? What are good examples of them? What are the pros, some of the struggles, and how to engage with that element of the miniature wargaming hobby in a meaningful way.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of avenues in that are interesting that I look forward to getting into. So, until then, happy gaming, and keep on keeping it together.
Keep on keeping it together. All right, everybody, have a great one.
Have a good one.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.